My name is Madison Pobis, and today we'll be discussing some strategies that you can use when shooting an interview on camera. Whether you've never shot with anything more than a cell phone, or you're perfectly comfortable with your favorite DSLR, brushing up on some of these soft skills will increase your chances of capturing sound bites that add new layers to your multimedia science story. I recently interviewed Scott Severson, a local grower in California, about how groundwater sustainability affects his livelihood. We'll be using this footage to discuss what and what not to do during your video interview. Let's get started. Remember that your subjects aren't actors. It can be incredibly awkward to be on camera. Try to craft questions that make it easier for your subjects to respond in a way that you can edit later without having to direct them to say specific phrases. You can always go back later to clarify once a subject is a little more comfortable on camera. A good example of this is in the introduction. Here we are, right at the start of my interview with Scott. What is your name, and where are the different growing operations that you have in the state? If somebody were to ask me, "What's your name?" my natural response would be, "Madison." But by asking Scott a double-barreled question, meaning two short related questions asked back-to-back, he's more likely to answer in full sentences. What is your name, and where are the different growing operations that you have in the state?
Okay, so my name is Scott Severson, and I personally farm almonds and walnuts here locally in Merced County.
Just like in written reporting, it's a good idea to ask clarifying questions as they come up in the conversation. But remember that we have to edit these into usable sound bites later on. During my interview with Scott, he mentioned an acronym, IPM, that I wanted him to define. Let's take a look at how he responds to my question.
Determining thresholds, whether treatments are even needed, using IPM approaches.
Can you define IPM for me real quick?
Integrated pest management. Yeah, it's basically first identifying the pest and figuring out,
This might have been easier to edit if Scott had said, integrated pest management is ... but instead we have these disjointed chunks.
Integrated pest management? Yeah, it's basically...
If I were to go back and ask this question again, I might instead say, can you define IPM and how you use it in your work? That might have made it a little bit easier for Scott to reply in a full sentence. Drafting a protocol with specific questions can help you make sure to get at least a few of the sound bites that you know you want for your edit later, and it can keep the conversation moving if you have a slightly more hesitant subject. But sometimes a question that you've drafted in advance just doesn't make sense with the flow of the conversation. Staying flexible and adapting on the fly will help build trust with your subject and make sure that you can reveal some of those unexpected moments in an interview. Let's look at this question for Scott. Even though we're in a balanced district here, stigma is still a thing that's going to happen and have some impact on people in the area. So what do you see as the most promising solutions for dealing with groundwater issues or for any kind of water supply issue that's going to become really important?
Can you ask that question again? So I'm make sure I...
The root of the question is actually pretty important to the story, but the phrasing of the question is pretty confusing. So instead, we shifted to talk about why this wasn't such a simple question to answer.
Can you ask that question again? So I'm make sure I...
It's an impossible question.
I know.
It really is.
Well, then maybe let's talk about that. Why is it such a difficult question to answer? That question, along with cutting across two cameras, yielded a bite that we could use in the final piece. When working on a written story, you may already end your interviews with an extremely open-ended question. We do the same thing with video, but with a few tweaks, we can actually make this closing question even more helpful once we get to the editing stage. Here's one way that you could conclude your video interview. Start by being clear about your expectations so that you and your subject can get the most out of this closing question. I'm going to take like 60 seconds. I'm going to ask you a question, and then at the end of the 60 seconds, you could just respond as you will, but it's mostly just to give you some time to think about it before you respond. So, it can be helpful to even have out a physical stopwatch so that your subject worries less about how much time has passed and can instead focus on how they might respond. When we intentionally introduce our closing question like this, it can actually help us do three main things. First, it gives your subject an opportunity to summarize anything that they think is important or they want to go back and clarify. What does the future of agriculture in California look like for you? What do you hope that it looks like for your children starting to take on the business? Second, by asking your subject to quietly reflect for anywhere from 30 seconds to over a minute, you create the perfect environment to record room tone. This is the ambient sound of the space that you'll want to smooth the audio between clips when editing. As an example, here's a selection of clips edited with room tone.
So my son now is going to take over. And you've got sons and daughters and involved in it. It's multi-generational and very deep-rooted in the family farms.
And then without room tone.
So my son now is going to take over. And you've got sons and daughters and involved in it. It's multi-generational and very deep-rooted in the family farms.
Third, this quiet moment with your subject gives you a good opportunity to record a video portrait or to have some footage where you could pull a still frame for your written story. The expression on their face usually matches the tone of the conversation without feeling too forced or staged. Remember, your subjects aren't actors. Even though many of the tips that we've been discussing have revolved around directing your subject less so that they can be more comfortable on camera, you're still acting as an advocate for your future viewers. It's totally okay to ask your subject to rephrase things that are confusing, or to ask them to summarize in a shorter way. The key with all of these tips is to help you strike a balance between building trust with your subject and making sure that you come away from a video interview with content that you can use to build a multimedia story. Do you have questions about how your favorite multimedia science stories are made? Drop us a line in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and happy interviewing!